We definitely do serve an amazing God. And those of you who are here for the first time, I want to welcome you once again. Um, Before we pass the time to Dr. Anderson for our main talk, we have something just for the kids, which John will also present to us. So I'd like to invite all the children to come forward. This is just your time. And I'm actually really looking forward to this because we're going to be talking about dinosaurs. So kids, why don't you come on forward?
Okay, well, this is specifically for you children, but I'm sure mums and dads are going to listen as well, because you'll learn a lot of things here that are very, very interesting. Dinosaurs. Okay, now, who's this guy? T-Rex, isn't it? That's who he is. Has anybody seen one? Have you ever seen a T-Rex? One without skin on. That's very good, because a lot of people might have seen their skeletons in museums. Now, why haven't you ever seen a live T-Rex? Right, well, the answer was that they died out 1 million years ago. Well, it is true that a lot of scientists think they lived a very long time ago, and they think that something killed them all off, but they don't know what it was. They think it might have been an asteroid that collided with Earth, but an asteroid collision or a meteorite shower or something like that, that's the most popular explanation for the reason that the dinosaurs disappeared. But lots of possibilities have been suggested, and there are some other theories. Some scientists think that they might have eaten something that disagreed with them, and maybe they got poisoned. Some have even suggested they know what it might have been, but I really don't think that's true. Some have suggested that they might have done something silly to themselves, but again, nobody really knows what they might have done. But if they believed their Bibles, if the scientists believed the Bible, they would know what really happened. And I'm going to tell you what really happened. Because the Bible tells us that God's creation took 6 days. It says that on the first day he made the earth, then the atmosphere, then the plants, then the sun, the moon and the stars, then the fish and the sea creatures and the birds. And the Bible says that Adam and Eve and all the land animals were created on day 6. So, that must have included the dinosaurs, because they were all land animals. So, according to the Bible, they were all created on the same day as people. And as we heard in the last talk, that was only about 6,000 years ago, not millions and billions of years ago. And after he'd created Adam and Eve and all the animals, God said that it was all very good. And they all lived in a garden where everything was perfect, and that would have included the dinosaurs living in that same garden. And the Bible says that they were all created to eat only plants and fruit, and not to rip each other up and kill each other. But then things turned really bad after Adam and Eve ate the fruit that they weren't supposed to eat. That was when people started killing each other and killing animals, and that's when animals started killing and eating each other. And after quite a while, things got very, very bad on earth. The Bible says that everything had been corrupted, that people were only doing and thinking about wicked things, and that the earth was filled with violence. It really must have been like the worst imaginable computer game, I reckon. And God decided that he had to destroy the whole world with a flood. But Noah was the one man who'd been faithful. And God told Noah to build an ark, and he told him to take on board that ark 2 of every kind of land animal that breathed air. Now, did T-Rex and the other dinosaurs live on the land? Did they live on the land? Did they breathe air? Yes, they did. So did they come on board the ark with Noah? Why didn't they? No. The answer I've been given is that they're too big, but that's not true. Sorry? Well, no, because Noah didn't have to go and round up the animals. God brought them to him. So I think he probably brought dinosaurs that were not going to eat all the other animals up. And yes, they were big, but they weren't too big to come on board the ark, because the ark was a very, very big ship. In fact, I was in the Navy for 20 years and I served on a lot of big ships, including the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne, and Noah's Ark was nearly that size. It was very, very big, a very large ship. So yes, it would have taken all the animals, including the dinosaurs. And one of the things that you've got to remember about dinosaurs, although some of them got to be very, very, very big, how did they all start off? They all started off in an egg, didn't they? And you know, the maximum size of an egg is about the size of an American football, because anything bigger than that, the engineering structure of the egg won't sustain it, because the egg has also got to be able to get oxygen in to diffuse from the outside to get inside the egg. So there is a limit to the size an egg can be, and it's about the size of an American football. So every dinosaur started off tiny in an egg. They were not huge to begin with. And because reptiles seem to get bigger and bigger as they get older, God only had to bring younger dinosaurs that were able to reproduce on board the ark. And all the other people, all the other animals, and all the dinosaurs that were not in the ark, what happened to them? They died in the flood, didn't they? And they got buried in the mud. And that's, of course, where we find their bones now. They're all buried in the mud. Some of them, though, the ones in the ark, they survived. And the Bible tells us that they were around after the flood and people drew pictures of them. But maybe there are some reasons why they're not still around. And dinosaurs were reptiles. And the climate of the world now is probably very different from what it was before the flood. Before the flood, it was probably a bit like you might have seen on the movie Jurassic Park, with lots of vegetation and hot steamy jungles, just ideal climate for reptiles, because reptiles, like dinosaurs, can't warm themselves up from the inside like we can. People can warm themselves up from the inside, and dogs and cats can, and other animals can, but dinosaurs can't, because reptiles can't do that. They get their warmth from outside, which is why you see snakes and lizards and crocodiles lying out in the sun. So that's probably the main reason why we don't see them now, that they must have died off because they couldn't withstand the climate. And if people would only believe their Bibles, they would really understand much better. And a lot of people have said, why doesn't the Bible use the word dinosaur? Well, it really is because that word hadn't been invented in the English language when our Bibles were first translated into English. The word dinosaur only was made up in about 1830, and our English Bibles were translated a long time before that. But what the Bible does talk about is dragons, and the Bible calls dinosaurs dragons, and lots of different people groups throughout the world were very familiar with dragons. Now I'm going to put up one here. This is a picture of St. George slaying the dragon. Now I want you to have a very close look at something interesting in this picture. Have a look at the tail of the dragon. What's it look like? Looks a bit like an arrow, doesn't it? Very, very interesting tail. Now, Trevor here, where are you, Trevor? I can't see you. No, right. Trevor will be able to tell me what country this flag is of. Maybe you children can. Do you know what country this is? Wales is the correct answer, as Trevor and all the other taffies in the audience will know. And take a look at the tail of the dragon. Isn't that interesting? Now, the Chinese talk about dragons too. And the Chinese calendar has got 12-year cycles. And one of those years is named after the dragon. And the dragon is a very big part of Chinese culture. Have you seen dragon dances and dragon ceremonies and all this sort of thing with the Chinese people? Yeah. Now, all the other animals, dogs, pigs, rats, ox and so on, isn't it interesting, you know, that countries as widely separated as Wales and China have got stories about dragons? Now, I don't know of any connection between the Welsh and the Chinese historically, do you? I'm sure there's no connection between their language and no ethnic connection, but they all have stories about dragons. And have a look at the tail on the Chinese dragon. Isn't that very interesting, that it's got a spiky tail as well? So next time you hear on television that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, you'll know it's not true. And I'm going to talk now to mums and dads, and you children can go back into your seats, and we're going to talk a little bit more about dinosaurs in the course of what I'm saying in this next talk. Okay, well, the title I gave this talk was The Evolution of a Creationist, and the reason I did that was because this is really partly a personal testimony. How I came to change from being a full-on, long ages, evolution-believing atheist into a six-day biblical, happened only about 6,000 years ago, creationist. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that's quite a transition from 4.5 billion years down to about 6,000 years. And I didn't really start off as an atheist. I don't suppose anybody really does that. I'm sure you'll recognise the city of Rome here. Well, I had a very, very solid Catholic background. Catholic schools. I went to a Christian Brothers primary school, a Jesuit secondary school in Melbourne. I knew a great deal about the Catholic religion. In fact, in my year 12 year at school, I got the Religious Knowledge Prize. So I knew quite a bit about Catholicism, but I didn't know a lot about the Lord. Anyway, I started the medical course at the University of Melbourne, and that's where the rot set in. In many ways, it was a blessing in disguise, because in my time in the atheistic wilderness, I was able to throw off any connection to Rome. And obviously, my desire to live my own life unfettered by any religious restrictions was the main reason why I left it. But evolutionary teaching did play a fairly large part. And in the old anatomy school at Melbourne University, they had a skeleton of a Tasmanian tiger. And the caption stated how remarkable it was that marsupials, which had followed a completely different evolutionary pathway to mammals, had turned up so similar. And they said the Tasmanian tiger skeleton was very similar to the skeleton of a dog. And of course, you can see indeed that they are very similar. But I readily accepted it without question, because there it was in the museum, and I naturally assumed that they wouldn't say that if it wasn't true. But when you think about it, how ridiculous really is it? Because here we have two animals supposedly following a completely different evolutionary pathway. They've both got 7 cervical vertebrae, and they also have one very prominent one that's very similar. Now, why would there be two completely different evolutionary lines that form this so-called convergent evolution. It doesn't make any sense, but I believed it at the time. We learnt about the supposed tree of life, how every living thing came from the first cell those millions and billions of years ago. And it was taught as fact. It was in all the textbooks, along with the story of the horse evolution and the classic example of the peppered moth that I'm going to mention later. And I didn't have any reason to doubt it. I didn't have any real religious or biblical background. I suppose in my early school days I'd heard a few Bible stories, but my transition was first of all to an agnostic and later to a fully persuaded atheist. And I got married to Heather, and she had similar atheistic views, and if the Lord hadn't had different plans for us, we would have quite happily stayed that way. But after about 4 years and 2 children, incredibly, Heather became a Christian right out of the blue through the ministry of her sister. Well, that really didn't rock the marital boat too much, because I knew that I'd been there and I'd done all that. And after all, we know that women need that sort of crutch because children can be very, very stressful. And as you know, we men cope a whole lot better under pressure, so we don't really need religion. And I didn't mind looking after the kids when she went to church. That was the least I could do. I was in the Navy as a medical officer, and we got a 3-year posting, the one that we'd been really looking for, to England to work in diving and submarine escape. And so off we went to England with, by this stage, 3 small children. And Heather joined a local fellowship, and a lot of books came into the house, and I'm a very avid reader. And also the men's group in the fellowship decided to outreach to all the unbelieving husbands, and they had some film nights and so on. And finally I became convinced that the resurrection happened to be true. And God confirmed that to me in a miraculous way, a bit like Paul on the Damascus Road. The Lord spoke to me, and I knew that Jesus had truly risen from the dead, and I knew that God was real, whereas I had never previously known that. And so I set myself to reread the Bible, starting at the beginning. And of course I didn't get very far before I rediscovered the conflict that I already knew was there. It talked about 6 days of creation, and I was able to add up the years like everybody else can, and it came to about 6,000. Well, I read it over and over again, and I couldn't make it say anything else. But the problem was that I knew that the earth was billions of years old. But for the first time in my life, I knew for absolute certainty that God was true. And therefore I knew the Bible had to be true because of God's integrity, because He doesn't lie and He doesn't deceive. And I started asking people in the fellowship that Heather attended, including people who had formerly been ministers, and all I got was very unsatisfying explanations which didn't resolve my conflict, a bit like the theistic evolutionists that we talked about before. But finally I found someone in that fellowship who suggested that there was a book I ought to read, and lent it to me. And it was this one, called The Genesis Flood. It's about 50 years old. I think it's probably out of print now, and it's probably a bit out of date too. But when I read that, everything fell into place, and we came back to Australia a few weeks after this, and I bought myself a copy. It was published in the 1960s, but it really transformed my thinking. And this is the book that began my journey from an evolutionist into a creationist, because the book showed how everything we see in the world around us can be explained by Noah's flood. And when you have it pointed out to you, it becomes absolutely obvious. An article in Creation magazine about 3 years ago on the 50th anniversary of the book paid a tribute to these guys for standing against the tide, because most of the mainstream denominations had capitulated to the evolutionists, and as I mentioned before, that is still the case to this day. most of the theological colleges overseas and even in Australia are the people at the top are theistic evolutionists. That hasn't been quite the same, I'm pleased to say, with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ellen White and George Macready Price, they were staunch supporters of the biblical account. But from what I hear, even within the Adventist movement, there are elements where the theistic evolution concept is creeping in and not agreeing with the 6 days of creation and the 6,000 years. But anyway, this book changed my life, and I've met many others in creationist circles who say the same. Because what it did, it caused Bible-believing scientists to take a much more critical look at what the evolutionists were actually saying. And what they found, of course, is that the whole edifice of evolution is nothing more than a house of cards. When you delve into it, it's got no solid evidential foundation and it collapses under scrutiny. And that's what I found as well when I started looking into it. And I'm now going to give some examples of the sort of things that I had to unlearn, having been a billions of years evolutionist and now becoming a creationist. Because I had assumed, and not unreasonably I suppose, that what I'd read in textbooks and in scientific journals was true. But I had to relook at this whole concept of long ages and evolution. They are separate issues, but they are linked. Where had they come from? Where had it all started? And that's when I found the link, and that's when I realised that it's very well known and many, many people are aware of it. Back in the late 18th century, there was this guy, a Scottish physician, I'm ashamed to say, called James Hutton. He decided after visiting this spot in Scotland, Sicker Point, that the earth must be older than the Bible said. And he wrote a book called Theory of the Earth. It was nothing more than his opinion. There was no objective evidence. He just thought that the rocks looked very old. Now, I ask you, how can you tell the age of a rock just by looking at it? You wouldn't have a clue what age it was. He was followed by a guy called Charles Lyell, who was a lawyer, and he also wrote a book called Principles of Geology. Again, that was purely his opinion. Likewise, he had no objective evidence to substantiate it. He did actually fabricate some. Lyell was a wealthy man, and in those days, in the early 19th century, people didn't travel a lot. But he travelled to Niagara Falls, and he made some inquiries about the erosion rate of Niagara Falls, because the Niagara River is working its way back up the Niagara Gorge, and the falls are not now where they used to be. And he worked out the distance, and even though the locals had told him that it would recede about 3 to 5 feet a year, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, he decided that it was no more than a foot a year, and therefore it must have taken 35,000 years for the Niagara Gorge to form. So he got back to England and he announced that the Bible was most certainly wrong, that it must have been older than 6,000 years. In actual fact, the erosion rates of Niagara Gorge are very, very consistent with the time since Noah's flood. Anyway, Hutton and Lyell proposed a very old earth and a principle that's called uniformitarianism. That is the idea that very slow and steady processes over vast amounts of time have produced the geological formations that we see all around us. And when Charles Darwin went on his famous voyage on HMS Beagle, the captain of the Beagle, Robert Fitzroy, gave him a copy of Lyell's book to read on the trip. So that book of Lyell's gave Darwin his belief in the vast ages of time, and that was what gave him the time that he needed to propose the possibility of evolution, the evolution of life. Remember, he was only a very young man. He was only 22 when he went on that voyage on the Beagle, and he was away from England for 5 years. His grandfather Erasmus had also written a book called Zoonosis, and that's got or zoonomia, and that's got a whole chapter on what we would describe as evolution. So Darwin went with the influence of his grandfather and the influence of Lyell, and these two men helped him to formulate his own long-age evolutionary ideas. And he subsequently abandoned his belief in the biblical account of creation, the time frame of Genesis, and ultimately his belief in God. And the scientific world eventually accepted Darwin's ideas, and that gave them a seemingly plausible explanation of origins which didn't include God, and of course that was what really opened the floodgates that we see open now. And not long after Darwin, but still well over 100 years ago, this geological column appeared with this scheme of layers, supposedly very primitive and early organisms at the bottom and later ones and people at the top, and a time scale along here of up to 650 million years. But they didn't have any evidence whatsoever for the millions of years. They were absolutely nothing more than people's opinion at that time. The fossils were assigned to the various layers, all done on the basis of long-age evolutionary belief, no hard evidence, just opinion. The number of years were complete guesswork, and there never was any objective evidence for any of it. It was belief that produced the diagram, not science. So it's not science, it's a religion. And all new discoveries are massaged into this long-age framework to bolster that belief. And of course, these days, it's radioactivity that is now used to prove the long ages. And we talked a little bit about carbon dating in the previous talk. I mentioned that carbon dating is only used for organic fossils, that things that were once living and contained carbon, and it's got an upper limit of 90,000 years, even if those years existed, which they don't. But you can't use carbon dating to produce millions and billions. It's rock dating that gives the idea of millions and billions, and it can only be done on volcanic rocks, not most of the rock that you see around the place, which is sedimentary rock. And the first thing we need to realise is you cannot directly measure a date. There is no such instrument as a datometer. You can't put a machine on a rock and have it spit out a date. You can only measure the quantities of elements in the rock. And to derive a date, you have to make a lot of very unverifiable assumptions. And they're all based on the pre-existing belief that the world is old. And that belief is derived only from opinion, not from evidence. When they do rock dating, they use transitions like uranium to lead, potassium to argon, rubidium to strontium, etc. But it only applies to volcanic rocks, as I said, not sedimentary rocks. And all of those processes involve the same assumptions. It assumes that you know the original composition of the rock. And in the case of uranium to lead, it assumes that there was no uranium, or only uranium to begin with, no lead. Well, you can't make that assumption, but that's the assumption that is made. It assumes that the rate of decay has been constant. Now, when they talk about these sort of elements decaying, their half-lives are in the millions and billions of years. Now, we simply don't know that that has been the case for all time. It is simply assumed that it was. It assumes there's been no contamination in an open system. No more uranium got into the rock, no lead diffused out. So nothing has been added, nothing removed according to the assumptions in an open system supposedly over millions and billions of years. Well, you simply can't make that assumption. And the rocks and the results are all over the place. The question was asked this morning about the lava dome on the Mount St. Helens volcano. Mount St. Helens in Washington State in the USA erupted in 1980. So the lava that forms the lava dome has only been formed in about the last 30 years or so. But when that lava is dated by rock dating, it dates in the millions of years. And it's the same the world over. There are plenty of examples. This is Mount Nuruhoe in New Zealand. It's erupted 3 times in the last 100 years, and the date of each eruption is precisely known because it was observed. The lava flows from each eruption are precisely known, but when the rocks from those lava flows are dated, they still give dates in the millions, even though we know that they're less than 100 years old. And it's the same story all over the world. You can find many examples of conflicting results like that with rock dating. And you also get some ridiculous results when you actually combine carbon dating with rock dating. This is an example here. This is a mine near Emerald in Queensland, and about 20 metres below the surface is this layer of basalt, which is a volcanic rock, and embedded in it is some charred wood. So obviously the 2 layers must have been formed at the same time. The wood dates to about 45,000 years, the basalt to 45 million years. So nonsensical results, and there are many, many others throughout the world like this. This is one from, from Sydney. Here's a piece of Sydney sandstone with some wood inside it, the wood dating at 34,000 years, fossil dating of the sandstone, and remember we said before that the rocks can be dated by the fossils and vice versa. That gives a fossil age of 230 million years, but the wood inside it, 35,000. So results are all over the place, and they are very frequently nonsensical. I want to mention rock layers, of course, because there was a question asked this morning earlier, and it's a similar pattern all over the world. And the obvious, this is Grand Canyon, but every time we drive to Sydney, we go through down the F3 or the whatever highway it's called now, and you see all of these sedimentary rock layers. And the conventional explanation is that they've been laid down by water over millions of years. And later, a little river gradually eroded the rock layers. That's the conventional view. The biblical view, of course, is that all the layers formed in the flood. Remember, the Bible tells us that at the end of the flood there was water runoff, the mountains rose, the valleys sank down, and the waters retreated to the position that they are now in. So the biblical view is that these layers all formed in the flood, and the layers are full of fossils, the remains of dead things that died in the flood. And this canyon would have been formed by torrential runoff after the flood. That is the common sense explanation, and there are plenty of examples throughout the world now of directly observed canyon formation in just that way. A great high dam bursts and the rock gets eroded by torrential runoff, exactly the same way as we believe Grand Canyon was formed. That's happened at Mount St. Helens, and there are many other gorges throughout the world that are now believed to have formed in that way. So, and the conventional explanation would actually require the river to run uphill. So those, I've got a fly buzzing around me. So those traditional explanations are obviously not really satisfactory. If we have a look at the layers from Grand Canyon as well, what you see is that there are razor-sharp edges between the layers, and some of these layers stretch for hundreds of kilometres, still with that razor-sharp edge between them. Now, what don't you notice between the layers? You don't see any soil layer, and you don't see any erosion layer. So how could they have been sitting there exposed for millions of years waiting for the next layer? especially when you compare it with here. Here are the lower layers. Look at the top, how irregular it is because wind and rain and erosion have made it irregular. It doesn't make any sense that the bottom layers could have ever been exposed to the elements, otherwise they would look similar. So, as I said, these layers have got fossils in them. Where do we find the fossils? Well, we find them everywhere. Even on top of the highest mountain ranges like the Himalayas and the Alps, they are topped by sedimentary rock containing marine fossils, shells and shellfish. This is Kuba Pedy. When the underground rooms at Kuba Pedy are dug out of the rock, the excavated sand is full of shells. In the middle of the South Australian desert, that's obviously been underwater as well. So the tops of the highest mountain ranges with marine fossils in their sedimentary rock, the underground rooms at Kuba Pedy full of shells, all evidence that is fully consistent with Noah's flood. But mainstream science emphatically denies that Noah's flood ever occurred, and it persists with an explanation that is inconsistent with the observed facts. There's a lot more I could say about those long ages, but I want to talk a little bit about evolution and particularly its fraudulent foundations. But I'm going to have to whip through that a little. We've all heard about the evolution of the horse. This was a display that appeared back in the 1870s. It was only ever one museum curator's opinion, but it was presented in textbooks as fact. You probably would have all seen in biology textbooks these embryo drawings of a German biologist by the name of Haeckel. He coined the idea that all embryos go through the same fish stage in their development because obviously we all came from the sea. His theories have been discredited for at least 50 years, and some years ago a British researcher took photographs of embryos at the same stage. These are the photographs. He proved conclusively that Haeckel was a fraud. The drawings were all fabricated simply to substantiate his theory. And amazingly enough, even though his ideas have been discredited for about 50 years, that hasn't stopped the New South Wales State Education Department from using them in exams. And this is a question from the HSC biology paper in 2012 with Haeckel's embryo type drawings and questions: how do the embryos provide evidence for evolution? Well, of course, they don't provide any evidence for evolution, but this is the sort of stuff that is still being taught in state schools and is being examined in the HSC exam. Embryos follow their developmental pattern, not because of evolution, but because of the programmed instructions in their DNA. So acceptance of evolution was never based on real evidence, just the scientific establishment's willingness to believe anything that excluded God, and the textbooks continue to do it. This is the famous story about the peppered moth. I'm not going to go into details, but it went along something like this. A moth in Britain changed from being a light colour to a dark colour over time because it was supposedly being preferentially picked off the trees by birds. Well, it turned out about 40 to 45 years after this had got into the textbooks that there was no evidence for this at all, and the photographs that were in the textbooks were actually dead moths glued to pieces of tree bark and then photographed. There was no evidence that the birds were eating moths in the daytime at all. It was fabricated evidence. I want to quickly mention Lucy, because you've probably heard of Lucy in our evolutionary ancestry. I want to make a point here. When a discoverer finds a fossil, the discoverer might actually have their own private museum, and that, of course, is where the fossil is going to stay. But all the museums, the big ones throughout the world, they want to have an example of it as well. So they will make up a plaster model of the original. And it looks very impressive when you see this model in a museum with a very human-like grasping hand, because apes can't use their thumb the way we do, and feet that look very human-like, and Lucy standing upright on her feet. Well, what was actually found from which this model is made? Well, that's all that was found, just those bones, and you'll happen to notice that there aren't any hands and there aren't any feet. So all of it was made up in that model is assumption. The fossil did not, what was discovered, did not give the evidence to produce the model like that. But millions of people the world over have had this stuff presented to them as fact, and if you were taking your child through a museum and you saw something like that, it looks very impressive, and your children would probably tend to believe it. I want to briefly mention this. This is Tiktaalik, the supposed fish that first walked on land. It was a bit like a big flathead, and it was a very big fish. It probably weighed about 150 kilograms. And the way the textbooks describe it, it is developing a pectoral girdle or a pelvic girdle that enables it to stand upright. Well, 150 kilograms is a pretty big flathead. I'm sure any of you who are fishermen would love to catch a flathead like that. But the original doesn't have that sort of support structure that would enable it to walk. So what you see in the diagrams in textbooks are actually fabrications. Also, for it to walk on land, it would have to develop lungs and breathe air. So the sort of diagrams you see don't show it with any gills, or maybe a few lines where gills might be, but when you actually examine the original had gills. So it is not in the process of changing to anything that walked on land. The reality is not there, it's just wishful thinking. Whale evolution is really a classic. It's believed that whales developed as land animals and started diving into the water, chasing after prey, and then they adapted themselves to the watery environment. But to evolve from a land animal to a water creature like that, the nostrils have to move from the nose to the back of the head to produce a blowhole. And lo and behold, when you see the models in the museums, they've got blowholes. But the original fossil that was found, that was called the whale precursor, doesn't have a blowhole. It's only got nostrils. So the blowhole is something that is artificially put there in the model by the museum. Likewise, land animals move their tails from side to side, just like dogs do. Now, if you think about it, to change a tail movement from side to side to up and down like a whale fluke, you would have to have a lot of different development of nerves and muscles and so on to operate a tail in that manner. And when you look at it in the museum, lo and behold, it's got a tail flute, so it can go up and down. Does the original fossil have that? No. So all of this is just embellishment by the museums. And of course, as we all know, there's no way that whales can evolve anymore because people won't allow it. And it really would be funny, wouldn't it, if it wasn't so tragic, because people's eternal future is at stake here, and yet the museums and the textbooks continually feed them lies. And that's why we say at Creation Ministries it is so important for young people particularly to be aware of this stuff and to be aware of the lies that are there in their textbooks and that they are going to be taught in schools. And the silly thing is, all of these incredible stories like whale evolution, they are concocted to prop up an unsustainable theory, but the obvious truth then gets suppressed. The evidence actually, and I'm going to come back to dinosaurs now, The evidence for dinosaurs being contemporary with man is very compelling. In the book of Job, the Bible mentions two strange creatures. It mentions Behemoth in chapter 40, and it says that he had a tail swaying like a cedar. Now, some of the later biblical translations call it a hippopotamus, but a hippopotamus doesn't have a tail like a cedar. The largest land animal actually is the elephant, and he's only got a wispy tail as well, so it can't possibly be a large land animal. The next chapter in Job mentions a large sea creature called Leviathan, and he sounds like a huge fire-breathing sea dragon. And both of these creatures are described by God to Job, so they must have been around for Job to see. Otherwise, God wouldn't have been describing to him something that he didn't know what he was talking about. When we have a look at some other examples, this is an example out of Carlisle Cathedral in England, which was built about 500 years ago, long before people were digging up dinosaur fossils. And this brass carving is clearly of a couple of dinosaurs in combat. And the brass carving in that cathedral also shows other animals and fish and so on, everyday creatures. For the people to have made that carving, they must have seen the live animal, because they didn't have any children's picture books of dinosaurs to copy from in those days. And notice again, look at the tail. See how it's got spikes on it, which is the same for the tail of St. George's dragon, the Welsh flag, and the Chinese dragon. This is a temple at Angkor in Cambodia, and this temple's 800 years old. And there's an animal depicted there, and I'm going to give you a close-up of it. And I'm sure if the children were here, they would call that a stegosaur. Now, it's clearly a carving of a live animal. They likewise didn't have children's picture books to draw from or copy from 800 years ago. So these animals must have been living at the same time as people. This is rock art from the state of Utah in USA, and all this rock art was done by Native Americans. And that picture actually comes from a book that's on the table down there called Dire Dragons. Very, very interesting, the result of the author's years of research, and it's very convincing. This is the legend of Beowulf. Beowulf was a Scandinavian. My grandfather came from Scandinavia. Beowulf might have been one of my ancestors, but he, in the epic poem, he killed an animal that sounds like T-Rex, and it was an animal that had slain 30 Viking warriors in a night. Well, there are not too many animals on earth today that could slay 30 armed Viking warriors in a night, and Beowulf killed it by getting in under its head and getting in under its teeth and twisting off its arm. And so it certainly sounds like a T-Rex. Some years ago, a lady by the name of Mary Schweitzer, who's the T-Rex expert, she dug up a fossil, and in that fossil, when they dissolved out the calcium, they found elastic blood vessels out of which they were able to squeeze red blood cells, and she proved conclusively that that's what it was. They were elastic blood vessels. They were red blood cells. She said the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know says that it should be gone. It should be completely degraded, and of course biological tissue should be degraded in that length of time, but they still haven't chucked out the 65 million years. They're trying to find out ways in which biological tissue might last that long. But really, it would be much more sensible to accept the blindingly obvious. This is a fossil Triceratops from the same area. They found actually in the bones, bone Haversian canals and bone cells as well in tissue that can't last millions of years. This is a hadrosaur, and some other researchers found intact skin from this hadrosaur. I just put this up. That's the little hadrosaur in an egg being held in the palm of a hand, just to remind you that all of these large creatures did come out of eggs. And you'll notice that the hadrosaur is living in a swamp. In the early days of settlement in Victoria, the local Aboriginal people were very terrified of an animal that they called a bunyip. And one of them helped the Geelong Advertiser artist draw this picture. And this appeared in the Geelong Advertiser back in 1845. Remember, long before Darwin. The Advertiser probably wouldn't put that in there these days, but they did then. And if you have a look at it, how similar to the hadrosaur is the bunyip. And the bunyip also lived in a swamp. So it's really very, very interesting that in Australian tradition there's probably hadrosaurs as well. I just want to move on to biology and mention DNA, which was one of the great scientific discoveries of the 20th century. DNA is a biological code or program using only 4 letters, the nucleotide bases, and we give them their first letter. But it is a far more sophisticated program than anything that man has ever come up with. You could liken it to a computer program, but really the reality is a computer program is a bit like DNA. DNA is far more sophisticated. The whole program's got about 3 billion letters, and we've got a complete copy in every nucleated cell in our bodies. This little program opens my Telstra My Account page. It's only got 112 letters compared with your 3 billion. And I can tell you now, it didn't write itself by trial and error. It got written by a computer programmer getting down there and writing it. And I can't improve that by randomly changing a letter or two here and there, which is what a mutation would be. If I start changing any of these letters, the program is not going to open at all, and we all know that. You don't improve a properly functioning program by randomly changing the symbols. It would be quite impossible for DNA to arise by chance. And the sophistication of it is simply amazing. There are codes superimposed on codes to about 4 levels. No human program has ever been written like it. I'm just going to skip the what did I do there? Oh. I want to skip that for the sake of time. I want to get back to the cell. Most of our DNA is in the nucleus, but we also have some DNA in our mitochondria. And interestingly enough, we only inherit mitochondrial DNA from our mother. We don't get any mitochondrial DNA from our father. When an egg gets fertilized, the nuclear DNA comes half and half from dad and mum, but the mitochondrial DNA only comes from mother when the egg cell divides. And it's been established, and they call her mitochondrial Eve, that we are all descended from the one woman. When this discovery one was done, it says 5 billion people from the one woman, but in actual fact, it's 7 billion people. It's been established that we all come from the one woman who has been called mitochondrial Eve. Now, we can't prove it's the biblical Eve, but it is consistent with that, isn't it? That we've all come from the one woman. Not only that, there was a recent article, some guy compared the Y chromosomes of a whole group of men from about 7 different ethnic groups right across the world, from Siberia to the Kalahari Desert and so on. And they decided that all men have their Y chromosome from the one man. They believe he lived 135,000 years ago, but they have established that they all came from the one man. And in the article I read, which was on Fox News, this is what they said. And you can see interspersed in this some fact, some fiction. It said, these primeval people aren't parallel to the biblical Adam and Eve. Well, who says? The writer says. They weren't the first modern humans on the planet. Who says? The writer says. That's not what was discovered. Instead, just the 2 out of thousands of people alive at the time. Who says? That's just opinion. Just the 2 with unbroken male or female lineages that continue on today. Isn't that a coincidence that we all trace back to one man and one woman? And remember what Adam said to Eve when he called her Eve. He said, "You will be the mother of all living." And she is. Mitochondrial Eve is the mother of all living. So all absolutely consistent with the Bible. The bottom line is, of course, that this word is truth, and we need to regard it as our authority and not the constantly changing science textbooks. Thank you. Thank you, Yoshi.
Father in heaven, I just want to thank you and praise you that for all that you've done for us and for all that's happened around, that, Lord, you still love us. And, Lord, we've just gotten a glimpse of everything that's happened in terms of how the world tries to distort what's out there in your creation, how you've loved us and made us. So, Lord, help us to continue to grow in this search for you. That may we continue to know who you are and the incredible God that you are. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.